Welcome to our prophecy study, and our prophecy study in this session is going to be chapter 18 of Revelation, and we're going to overlap. The last session ended with verse 7. I'm going to start there again because we didn't get through everything that I wanted to say on verse 7, so we're going to overlap, and I'll begin by reading verse 7 first, then we'll go back, and the first part of verse 7 we've already talked about, so we'll pick it up from there. So verse 7, Revelation 18. Give her as much torment, and what we're talking about here now is Babylon. Just a reminder, we're talking about, in chapter 17, we've already seen religious Babylon, which was the apostate church, and now in chapter 18, we are into the economic and political aspect of Babylon. And so we've already been talking about that. This is Antichrist's kingdom. In the book of Daniel, this was the kingdom that had not come yet. The Medes and Persians had already fallen. The Babylon Empire had already fallen. The Roman Empire in John's day was active in John's day, and then one of the horns of Daniel had not come yet, and that was Antichrist's kingdom. So that's what we're talking about here. So when it says give her, we're talking about the Antichrist's kingdom. Give her as much torment and grief as the glory and luxury she gave herself. In her heart she boasts, I sit enthroned as queen. I am not a widow. I will never mourn. Now, this part about I am not a widow, I will never mourn, remember that she is the bride of Antichrist who is still alive at this point. So this false system, false political and really bad system of economics and politics is very bad, and it's the politics and economics of Antichrist. And so just like the church is going to be the bride of Christ, it's this false system that is the bride of Antichrist. And remember, Antichrist mimics many things that Christ did. And so where it says, I am not a widow, because the husband, in this case, Antichrist, is still alive. They haven't been thrown into the lake of fire yet. So this is very close, but just before the Battle of Armageddon. So Antichrist is still alive and around, and that's why the political system, Babylon, says, I am not a widow, because the Antichrist is still around. Now, I'm going to read Isaiah 47:15, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back a couple screens, and, well, I guess you can read it off there. It's grayed out, but I think you can still read it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read Isaiah 47 verses 8 through 15. But while I read Isaiah 47, you kind of glance at this. And 8 through 15 obviously is 8 verses. This is only one verse, but Isaiah is going to repeat a few things a few times. So you read this as I read Isaiah, and watch how many times that they come together, showing that they're talking about the same false political and economic system of the Antichrist. I'm reading from Isaiah 47, starting in verse 8. Now then, hear this, you sensual one, who dwells securely, who says in your heart, I am, and there is no one beside me. I will not sit as a widow, nor loss of children. Remember, at this time, the Antichrist children, if you will, are still alive. They're still the ones that are running this system. And so the false bride says, I am not a widow, nor have I lost my children. But these two things will come on you suddenly in one day, loss of children and widowhood. They will come on you in full measure. in spite of your many sorceries, in spite of the great power of your spells. You felt secure in your wickedness and said, "No one sees me." Your wisdom and your knowledge, they have deluded you, for you have said in your heart, "I am, and there is no one beside me." But evil will come on you, which you will not know how to charm away. And disaster will fall on you, for which you cannot atone. And destruction, about which you do not know, will come upon you suddenly. This is going to be on one day when Christ comes again. Stand fast now in your spells and in your many sorceries with which you have forced from your youth. Perhaps you will be able to profit. Perhaps you may cause trembling. You are wearied with your many counsels. Let now the astrologers, those who prophesy by the stars, those who predict by the new moons, let them stand up and save you from what will come upon you. Behold, they have become like stubble. Fire burns them. They cannot deliver themselves from the power of the flame. There will be no coal to warm by, nor a fire to sit before. So those have become to you with whom you have labored, who have trafficked with you from your youth. Each has wandered in his own way. There is none to save you. So that's what Isaiah is saying about this Babylon. So you've seen a lot of it here. We're going to look part of this Isaiah 47. We're going to see again in the next few verses. I couldn't put all the Revelation verses up at the time, but we're going to get. So kind of remember the gist of what Isaiah had said. So now into verse 8. Therefore in one day, and Isaiah had mentioned that, in one day. Therefore, in one day, her plagues will overtake her, death, mourning, and famine. She will be consumed by fire, for mighty is the Lord God who judges her. And again, this is Christ coming again at the very end of Armageddon as he's making war on the Antichrist and all of Antichrist's forces. It'll take place in one day. She'll be consumed by fire. In Daniel 5, Babylon fell in one day, the same day as Nebuchadnezzar made his great boast. In Daniel 5:30, Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon, and he said that very night, or I should say Belshazzar, that very night Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. So he was slain in one city, one night. But remember, Babylon did not burn, nor did Babylonian people die. They only killed the king and those that were with the king at this big party that, if you remember Daniel, they were actually drinking alcohol out of the goblets that they had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. When Babylon sacked Jerusalem, they took the temple items and they brought them back to Babylon. There they sat for years, and now this night that they're taking these things out and defiling the instruments of the temple by drinking alcohol out of them as he proclaimed his great city, the Medes, Darius the Mede, came in quietly under the city, killed the Belshazzar, went out. The rest of the people that weren't in the palace that night didn't even know, history says, for 3 days that their king had even been slain. They didn't know.
Can you tell them how they got into that great big
So in Babylon, because the walls around Babylon were so thick, you could ride 2 chariots side by side on top of the walls. And so they had protected themselves. And usually what happens back in warfare in those days, the attackers would just lay siege. Many of these walls were so big, you just couldn't batter them down. They obviously didn't have artillery and stuff like that. So they would just lay siege to the city, which means no food or water coming in and out, and eventually they'd just starve the people. Well, they had food laid up for years in the walls and in the city of Babylon, and the river Euphrates ran through the city. So they had all the water that they needed. Well, what had happened was the Medes had diverted the Euphrates, and once the water level went down, because they diverted it, and remember, there were no guards out there because they felt so secure, they didn't have any watch guards out there. They thought nobody could get them. And so there was nobody that saw what was going on about the Euphrates. You know, you'd think somebody'd look out and say, gee, the water is not as high as it was a few minutes ago. They didn't get that. And so the water went down, so where it came into the city, they didn't even lock the gates. There were iron gates that went into the water. They didn't even lock those. So the Medes just basically wait for the water to go down, marched right in there, came up inside the palace, you know, at that time attacked. They were all drunk and, you know, full and too full and taking naps and stuff like that, that they just killed those that were within, and then they went out again. And like I said, people didn't even know for a while.
I think they killed Belshazzar.
Yeah, they did the people inside, you know, in the palace, but not the Babylonians. So when we're looking at Babylon here, and it's going to be talking about the city burning with fire and people dying, this is not Babylon of Daniel's day. This is Babylon of the future. You can tell because there's a vast difference on how they were conquered. So that is the point that I was making. Verse 9, when the kings of the earth who committed adultery with her and shared her luxury see the smoke of her burning, they will weep and mourn over her. Again, let me remind you of what we had spoken about earlier. Remember, there was, first of all, you had the harlot, which was the apostate religion. And if you remember what the harlot looked like, she was decked out in fancy clothes and attire, and she had stones and gold and all kinds of riches and stuff like that. That was the false church. And then Antichrist gave his power to 10 kings who now slew the church, the false apostate system, and took all those riches. 10 kings did. And so this says, now when the kings of the earth who committed adultery with the false political and economic system and shared her luxury, because they took all that from the apostate church, all that we've already seen about the harlot riding the beast, and shared her luxury, see the smoke of her burning, they will weep and mourn for her. So these are now the kings that were now in power, that Antichrist gave his power. Now they're seeing and weeping and mourning over Babylon falling. So the kings of the earth, this is the political aspect. So this is how we get into the political and the economics. I haven't quite got into the economics yet, but this is how we see the political aspect, because this is all intrigue and, you know, bribery and all this stuff that Antichrist is doing with these kings. Remember the 10 kings who received the power from the beast. Now, they were delighted in the destruction of the apostate religious system because they got the harlot's possessions. Now they're going to learn about the fickleness of the Antichrist, as he will now do the same to them. And so, in other words, they thought they were on the inside. They were thought that they were good to go because they were doing the bidding of the Antichrist. And the Antichrist basically has captured the whole world. And so if you're one of the kings of the Antichrist, you basically have no fear. You think you are set for life. You've got all these riches. Nobody can defeat the Antichrist. So you think that you're good to go. And so now they're going to learn that actually they're not safe either, as long as you're in the vicinity of the Antichrist. So now here, and even though, and I know this is difficult to relate to, but I'm going to give you a scenario. So we're saying that Babylon is a city. Yes, it is. It's an actual building, because we're going to, learn about things being burnt. And then we're also saying that Babylon is a system. Let me show you how to relate to this. If I say to you, Wall Street is not doing very well. You, because you that are listening to my voice, at least are in this room, are Americans. We don't live that far away from New York City. But when I say Wall Street is not doing very well, you are thinking the stocks are down, the stock market is not doing very well, people are leaving money. You are not thinking, oh, does it have potholes? Is there sewer running down the street? So when I say Wall Street, yes, it is a street. We have been and walked down Wall Street. It's there. The bull is there, you know. And so, but that's not what it's talking. It is a street, but when we say in America, Wall Street is not doing well, we're thinking about the economic system of America. So when we're talking about Babylon here, yes, it's a real city, but understand that it is also talking about an economic and political system. So hopefully that clears up kind of the symbolism here. Babylon is the seat of the Antichrist, and this is literally a rebuilt Babylon. You can't take a flight and visit Babylon right now. There's basically nobody living there. You know, there may be a few Bedouins and some animals and wild animals and stuff, and there are little towns around Babylon, but Babylon, as it existed, is not a city today like Jerusalem or some of those other. Damascus is an Old Testament city. Damascus is still around, capital of Syria. So Babylon right now in 2026 is really not a city there. And so what we're talking about is Babylon is going to be rebuilt. Understand, you've got at least 7 years worth of tribulation time that Babylon could be built, and probably is. So while the temple in Jerusalem is being built, your Antichrist is now building his seat of the government. It's not going to be Jerusalem. That's God's seat of power. That's where Christ was. That's where he died and rose again and so forth. And so Antichrist is going to have his version of that city. It's not going to be called the Holy City. It'll be called the Great City. So Babylon is Antichrist city, and now it is going to be destroyed. We saw in that last verse the smoke of her burning. So yes, there are a lot of stone walls and stuff, but there's still a lot of wood and still a lot of material stuff. So the smoke of her burning is going to go up.
But doesn't he set up the temple for him to be worshipped in the temple?
In Jerusalem, yeah. But that's not the seat of his power. That was, just a temple that he's going to set up his idol and force people to bow down to that. But his day-to-day operations, probably to get him away from Jerusalem and get him away from God's people, at least while these things are going on. And for a while, remember, he's going to be, for the first 3.5 years, going to be friendly to the Israelites. So he's rebuilding Babylon out of sight. The burning of the city is reminiscent of Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember, because that was so bad, God did the same thing and rained down sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah. If you want to refer back to that, read about that, it's Genesis 19:28. Now, perhaps these kings of the east will see this smoke on their way to Armageddon. So, my wife likes maps. I always do what my wife says. So I've got you a map. So here's a map. Let me point some things out to you. First of all, here is Babylon, right there. You can see the Euphrates River, and then there is Jerusalem over on that side. We're talking about Babylon right there. Now, in Revelation 16:12, that we already looked at, the sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river. So here in 18, this has already happened. Euphrates, and its water was dried up to prepare the way for the kings from the east. Now, elsewhere, we're going to read that this army coming from the east is 200 million. Now, you've got to believe if it's coming from the east this way, and it's an army of 200 million. It just so happens that the two most populous countries in the world are to the east. India and China could easily make up an army of 200 million. And so here in chapter 18, we're reading that Babylon is burning, and don't take this red line as anything. I'm just pointing out where they're coming from in the east and where they're going to, where Armageddon is over there. So they basically have to pass by pretty close to Babylon. Now, don't take this to scale or anything like that, but it looks like that they are coming close enough to Babylon that they can see the smoke arising. And I don't know how many miles that is. I mean, they don't, the Euphrates, they could cross the Euphrates wherever because it's dried up. But I just find it interesting that they happen to be coming from the east. And while this is happening, they're going to be going by Babylon. So that's how those two verses fit together, that they will notice the smoke going up. Let me show you while I got this map on here, one thing we're going to come to in a little bit, but I want to show you while I've got the map. Here's the Persian Gulf. Now, you've seen what has happened in recent news where the Strait of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf kind of pinches off, and all the ships have to bring their oil. All the oil is coming from around here, and that Strait of Hormuz is down here somewhere. And, they're trying to sneak through there. So we know that great ships can come up here. Now, very possibly, I didn't look this up. I don't know how far up the Euphrates River big ships can come right now. That I don't know. But I know smaller boats can. So if nothing else right now, ships can come up here and unload their merchandise, and it can be ferried up the Euphrates as far as Babylon on these smaller boats. This is before they dried up the city, like as we're talking right now, especially during the tribulation period, the Euphrates is still kind of a waterway to allow a lot of the goods from the Persian Gulf to come up to Babylon. Verse 10, terrified at her torment, they will stand far off and cry, woe, woe to you, great city, you mighty city of Babylon. In 1 hour your doom has come. It's beginning to be a theme here, 1 hour. It's quickly. It's going to happen quickly, because when Jesus comes back, he doesn't have to win battle by battle. He's not going to be stuck. If you know your American history, they could fight over Little Round Top for days and sometimes weeks in some of these places before they gain any ground. It's not going to be like that. When Christ comes again, it's going to be, now whether it's going to be 1 hour, I don't know how long it's going to be, but read that as at least being a short time period, not going to be a big, long, drawn-out battle. So they are terrified at her torment. These are still talking about the kings. They will stand far off and cry, woe, woe to you, great city, mighty city of Babylon. In 1 hour your doom has come. So they are going to stand far off. These are the kings. Now they're not so sure they want to be associated with the beast, lest they suffer the same destruction. Yeah, they thought that they were going to be safe with the Antichrist. Now they see the smoke and they're saying, yeah, I don't think we're going to go and get into that battle. We're safe over here where we are. Let's not venture any closer. Notice it says, woe, woe. Anytime when you see something like that repeated in the Bible, it's their way of writing emphasis. So it's double woe for Babylon. And it says the great city as opposed to the holy city. Remember, Antichrist is just a copier. He can't create anything. He has to copy what he sees Jesus doing. Jesus had the holy city. Antichrist probably figured, I like that. I don't want a holy city, God forbid. I don't want that. But I think I'll call mine the great city. And so, again, he imitates Christ. So the great city and the mighty city. Verse 11, the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargoes anymore. So the merchants are realizing an economic aspect to the Babylon system. We said this was political. We saw the kings. Now we're talking about a different class of people. These are merchants. So the kings were saying, whoa, whoa, look what's happening. Now the merchants are weeping and mourning over her because no one buys their cargo. They don't care about the people inside. They really probably don't even care about the Antichrist. But they know if that's where they were planning on bringing all their cargoes and it's going up in smoke, they're not going to be able to deliver their cargoes anymore. And so that's why they're weeping and mourning, is because they've basically lost their gravy train. And then see if you can make something out of what's in these verses. I'll tell you afterward what it is, but as I read through some of these things, see if you can maybe pick it up. It took me a while to read it, and I admit, I had a commentary that pointed it out. I might have seen it, might not have seen it, but see if you can notice something about these materials. He's gonna list off all the things that Babylon has now lost. Cargoes of gold, silver, precious stones, pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, scarlet cloth, every sort of citron wood, and articles of every kind made of ivory, costly wood, bronze, iron, marble, cargoes of cinnamon and spice, of incense, myrrh and frankincense, of wine and olive oil, of fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and carriages, human beings sold as slaves. They will say, the fruit you longed for is gone from you. And here's a clue as to what I asked you to notice. All your luxury and splendor have vanished, never to be recovered. Did you notice anything about some of these things?
Wasn't it the temple?
The what?
Everything they used in the temple, wasn't it?
Yes and no. Many of it is, but not all of it. Not so much that. But so what we looked at in general was jewelry, clothing, fine silk, building materials, expensive wood, not, pine from the forests of Maine, but expensive wood and ivory and building supplies, spices, incense, certain foods, and battle provisions. If you notice anything about those, most of them are luxury items and they're not necessary. Cinnamon, yeah, it's nice. I love putting cinnamon on my French toast. But you know what? People got along a long time without cinnamon. So these spices, incense, what good does that do? Might cover some smells, but it's, these things are not basic, for the most part, not basic necessities of life. They are mostly the luxuriant type of things. Most, if not all, the stuff are luxury items. So again, what God is pointing out is they've gone overboard. They were, lavishly, and we see that today, and it's a big knock and not totally unfounded on today's society, where on one hand you have people living high on the hog, way overkill, and then you have other people that are starving and barely can put food on the table. And so this is, what God has pointed out, Jesus had pointed out when he was here, but now it's taken to the extreme, and that is what God finds reprehensible. And then human beings sold as slaves. What's the buzzword now for that? Human trafficking, okay? Yes, it's slavery, but now, for whatever reason, they call it human trafficking, and we see horrible, especially when we're talking about girls and stuff like this, that human trafficking, but basically human trafficking is slavery. Always has been, and it's just as wrong no matter how they tried to paint it. And I understand. I love America, and America's got some sin in their past, and not all the stuff was good. But people that were using and have used the Bible as trying to justify slavery were just flat out wrong. And this is what happens when you get away from the Scripture, is the Antichrist is saying now slavery is okay and these people are second-class citizens or something like that. So these are some of the things that God is condemning, and Babylon is going to fall over. So we will leave off there. Next time that we pick up, we'll be starting in verse 15, and we've seen the political and economic system called Babylon that God is going to destroy. And I pray that you will read your book of Revelation, especially 18, as we may close it out next time, but certainly work a little bit closer towards verse 24. So until next time, may God richly bless you.